Hi Nina, how you doing today?
I am just fine. How about you?
Good, good. Thank you so much for giving me the pleasure of speaking with you and picking your brain and sharing all your knowledge with our listeners. I really appreciate it.
Really happy to. Thanks for the invitation. I've
Mhm.
been learning a lot as I've been, delving into some of the work that you do, and it's always fun to have a back and forth.
Yes, yeah. So actually, I'm hoping that what we sort of talk about today, I kind of like sort of bring back and bring within a polyvagal, lens. Obviously, a lot of our listeners have a polyvagal background, and it is most practitioners who listen, or even people who listen, um, are involved in or interested in using the Safe and Sound protocol. And I think that a lot of practitioners just have a very I'm hoping what we can do today is to help expand that knowledge around the impact of sound on our brains and our bodies, and just um, how important that world is. So, and I think your work's going to help sort of open that up a little bit more. So yeah, thank you again. So I thought maybe we'll just start with, because you've got quite extensive career, and maybe just share a little bit of background about how you came to be Professor Nina Cross at Northwestern University. So
I think it's a combination of luck and desire. I sure didn't make any conscious decisions as I was going along in terms of, oh yeah, I want to become a scientist. I want to become a professor. It just happened, and I think it just evolved out of my interest in in sound and the brain. I grew up in a household where we spoke a couple of languages, and my mom was a musician, and she often sang harmony also with my dad, who also played violin, and they would sometimes play duets. So I grew up in a musical household, and when I went to college, I majored in comparative literature because I knew some languages and I liked to read. And then something that they're not doing very much anymore in university is, when I went to university, we had distribution requirements. And so I had to take a distribution requirement in biology, in the sciences. And I loved biology. I thought, oh my goodness, this is great. So I wouldn't have known about it unless I had been asked to take a class in that area. And I also at that time I discovered a book by Eric Lenberg, and the book is called Biological Foundations of Language. And so I thought, oh, you can combine these things. Language is something that I have was thinking about, um, and that there could be a biological perspective. And I think that one of the things um, that I think I'm pretty good at is seeing how seemingly uh, different things come together.
mhm.
And so I really thought, well, this is great. I just want to keep thinking um, about sound and the biology underlying it. So, and I think also in terms of what makes me is that, having grown up in two countries and with mostly two languages, um, I don't feel as though I can pass for an Italian or that I can pass for an American.
Mm-hmm.
What I feel is that I belong at the intersection of these countries and cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think that with my work as a biologist, I've always, and again, this wasn't a conscious choice. I just always found myself across disciplines.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's because we're going to be talking about your book of Sound Mind, and I think that's what the beauty of what the book brings. And I think as my background is as an occupational therapist, and then I did a master's in psychology, and I think we think a little similar in terms of that sort of bridging of different disciplines. And often sound is seen as an audiology sort of area, or it's speech pathology, but through just my learning journey as well, the impact of sound as an OT, I just don't think you can not pay attention to, how we process sound in our world and how that enables us to engage socially, how it enables obviously to learn, to read, but has a lot to do with our whole psyche in terms of our sense of self and our mind wellness. So I think this knowledge around the impact of sound or auditory processing or the acoustic world really does need to expand it across disciplines.
Yeah, it's much more holistic
Mm.
than I think typically it's thought of.
Yes,
And,
yes. Oh, that's the audiology
yeah,
world.
yeah. Well, and also, there are many people who, one way or another, are interested in sound and the brain, and from certainly the different areas that we research.
Mm.
If you look at the homepage of our Brain Volts website, you see that we study concussion, head injury in athletes. We study music, we study rhythm, aging, language disorders, autism, dyslexia, bilingualism.
Mm.
Uh, so, you know, again, sound is so pervasive across
Mm.
all of these different disciplines.
Mm.
And you might wonder, what are we doing at Brain Volts? But in fact, we are thinking about sound and the brain.
Mm. Mm.
And the reason that I decided to write this book of Sound Mind is that I wanted to have this information all in one place. I wanted to be able to communicate to any curious reader, anyone um, who it's almost everyone who is involved with sound one way or another. And my goal was really that no matter how much or how little you know about the topic, I think that it's my hope that you can get something out of the book.
Mm. Well, I
And
think you
and
definitely
I
achieved that.
thank you.
Mm.
But I wrote it conversationally,
Mm.
so it has a very conversational tone, but it is deeply referenced,
Mm.
and it sits on the accumulated scientific literature. And so I'm not just saying,
Mm.
these aren't just my opinions. um, I'm a biologist, so I'm looking at sound in the brain from a biological perspective, and trying to pull together, what do we know?
Mhm,
And
mhm, mhm.
there really is quite a bit to know.
Exactly, exactly. So getting back to your journey, so you took the biology class and you read the book about language. So then where did your journey take you?
Well, I decided to go to graduate school, kind of in neuroscience, and to study sound and the brain. And I first worked with Peter Dallas, who has done some of the most important and pioneering and formative work on the inner ear, the outer hair cells in particular. And I was working in his lab, and I was studying something called two-tone suppression in the auditory nerve, which is how different tones um, combine to form something that you really can't predict from the two tones by themselves. And I thought it was pretty fascinating. And at that time, I was telling my mom about what I was doing, and she was saying, Nina, what are you doing, really? And I realized very clearly then that two-tone suppression is something that I could talk to maybe, I don't know, 16 people in the world about, and that really my interest was to do something that lives in the world, in the world outside of the ivory tower, that lives in the world where my mom lives. And I felt at that time that if what I was doing was not something that I could explain to my mom, I really didn't want to be doing that thing.
Mhm.
So then, what I did is I still was studying sound in the brain with neurons and electrodes in animal models, and I was recording from single neurons in the rabbit auditory cortex. And it was a formative experience for me because, I would have a rabbit and a neuron and a sound, and the neuron would respond in a certain way to that sound. And then when I taught the animal that the sound had a meaning, that it would signal some form of reinforcement, with same rabbit, same sound, same neuron, but the neuron's response was different.
Mhm.
So, I could really see firsthand that as we learn, as we make sound to meaning associations, our brain changes.
Mhm.
And one way or another, I've been studying and thinking about this idea because our life in sound makes us us. No two people will respond to sound in the same way,
Mhm.
because their life in sound is different. We've learned different things: the languages we speak, the music we make, the
Mhm.
language disorders we might have.
Mhm.
Um, all of
Mhm.
these things influence how we hear the world, and we learn
Mhm.
through that hearing.
Mhm. I think what you're saying is so important. And I know I listened to another interview you did, and you played. I think they're on the Brain Faults website, but you play recordings of, and I know that we'll explain that you can actually take EEG recordings of the brain, which basically replicate the sound source, and that you had three different, I mean, you'll probably explain it much better than I am, but I know you had a sentence and you had three different people who heard that sentence. And yet when you recorded the EEG of those three different people, there was some slight, they're all hearing the exact same original auditory stimuli, but yet their brain processed that sentence slightly differently. Am I
Yeah,
saying
that's
that
absolutely
correctly?
right.
Mm.
And as I'm talking to you, the neurons in your brain,
Mm.
and mine, that respond to sound are producing electricity,
Mm.
and we can measure that electricity with scalp electrodes.
Mm.
And actually, the brain sings. As a neuroscientist, if you put an electrode into the brain, you will hear, if you attach the electrode not only to a screen that you can see the voltages of electricity changing, but you can hear the electricity. So think of it's like static in a way that you hear tss, 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 tss. And depending on where you are, there are telltale signs of what the neuron activity is going to be. And it's one of the ways that we guide our electrodes, because if you are in an auditory responsive area, if I'm playing a sound that repeats, a sound that goes bing, 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 if I've hit some part of the brain that responds to sound, I will hear tss, 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 tss. So, there is this electricity that happens in response to sound. And if you are able to sample many, many, many neurons at once, which is what we can do with electrodes on the scalp, and we can measure the population response of these many, many neurons in the same way as you can. Right now, as I'm speaking with you, my voice is being picked up by a microphone, and then there is an electrical signal. The electrical signal is then fed back to the speaker that enables it converts the sound, the electricity back to sound. And the same thing happens in the brain because the currency of the nervous system is electricity. So if I measure your brain's response to sound, I can take that electricity, and just as you would an MP3, these are these electrical events that you can then play through a speaker and not only see the brain's response to sound, but you can hear it. And if your sampling is really, really high and you're very clever, and you have equipment that will not impart any jitter between the timing of the stimulus delivery and the recording of the response, you can actually pick up the brain's response to a sentence, to a piece of music. And you're right. You will still recognize the sentence as that sentence as we all play it back. But it will sound different if it is coming from your brain or my brain or anybody else's brain. And we all have kind of our neural timbre, our neural signature. And we can take the same person and measure their brain's response to sound. If I measure your brain's response to some speech today, and then in a year or two or three, I measure your brain's response, well, it certainly will have changed based on your life in sound, but it will also be very recognizable as your signature.
So interesting. So when I read that, it made me think about, well, because a lot of listeners work in a mental health arena, that to be aware of what they're actually communicating. How is their listener actually listening to that sentence? And I think that nuances of hearing it might not be always how a therapist might be expecting them to actually hear it, because I know when we're going to talk about sound and the different components of sound, that those are well, often we talk about the prosodic inflection, but I know you talk a lot about the harmonics and how that gets wired into our neurons, but really based on this life experience in sound as we grow up. And I guess that's what I kind of wanted for us to kind of really unfold, because a lot of people work with children with autism or individuals with developmental trauma, where their life in sound is not always the most healthy experience. I wonder if you just wanted to add a little bit to that.
Yeah. No, I think that, I think one of the reasons that you and I are so in love with sound is because it carries so much information, and so much information um, about our emotions, and about um, how we're feeling at the moment, how someone else is feeling. One of the very fascinating things about sound in terms of its characteristics is that sound connects us, and it connects us in a way that nothing else does. I mean, you and I right now, we're having a conversation,
Mhm.
and there's no script.
Mhm.
It's a back and forth,
Mhm.
and it's reverberant, it's resonating, it is
Mhm.
um, it's alive.
Mhm.
It is alive, and it is what my hero Ian McGilchrist calls betweenness.
Mhm.
He talks about the betweenness and the flow of many things, and to me, sound really epitomizes, is emblematic of this concept of betweenness. So the betweenness between a therapist and a parent, a therapist and a child, this is a very important back and forth. And because the sound mind, I think that a premise of my book is that the hearing brain is vast,
Mhm. Mhm.
and the
Mhm.
hearing brain engages how we think, how we feel, how we move, and how we combine the information from our other senses. So,
Mhm.
the fancy formal way of saying that is that the hearing brain engages our sensory, cognitive, motor, and reward systems.
Mhm.
But in fact, it does.
Yes.
And so through sound, and this is why sound is so important therapeutically, and how it connects us in every way, for better or for worse. Sound really engages all of these parts of us.
Mhm.
And so, if we've had experiences, and experiences that we associate with sounds, and that they may not be um, the kinds of experiences that we feel safe about. So for example, in terms of the evolution of sound and our brain's ability to make sense of it, sound is our warning sense, and
Mhm.
it will make us aware of danger.
Mhm.
And so, in the same way as it can make us aware of, oh, this is a source of food, or this is a potential mate,
Mhm.
sound is so fundamental
Mhm.
to the life of um, any organism.
Mhm. And I think you
Um,
talk about that in your book, A Sound Mind, that how our ability to perceive sound is evolutionary, ancient. And I know from a polyvagal perspective, that whole Portis's theory is really based on evolutionary biology of how our autonomic nervous system um, has evolved and become more sophisticated over time. But you're exactly right. Our whole experience with sound, um, it's an old ancient neural system wired into our bodies for survival, essentially, isn't it? Survival, and then as we evolve for connection.
yeah, and also I think that if I talk about that I study sound in the brain, but when I say brain, I include every part of our body, so that our heart and lungs, and the uh, various sympathetic, parasympathetic responses of all of our organs and our cells interact with, um, again, even, I think we think of sound as being a holistic concept. Well, certainly the brain is extremely holistic, and much more holistic, in my view, than is often um, portrayed in the typical lecture hall, where people want to see, oh, where in the brain is this happening? Oh, things are lighting up, and the brain is, it's inherently a paradox, in that, yes, there are specialized areas in the brain, but it works to the extent that the brain works together. So you have this circuitry that um, really depends on the entire thing in order to work. And I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
Mhm.
And and think about how sound evolved even before we, organisms were able to um, communicate in the kinds of language that we now use, or that animals use in various very sophisticated forms of communication.
Mhm. And I think you, in your book, you sort of helped to expand that, because I know my learning certainly of going into the acoustic sort of world was just learning that sort of, ear to brain neural pathway and the different sort of processing sort of junctions along the way. And there really wasn't much in that sort of, efferent system of coming back from the auditory center back to, feeding back information back to fine tune our listening, or networks to other areas of the brain. And we know, naturally, we know if you listen to music, you feel good, feel like your motor system comes on board, where you want to move to that. And the same when we hear, and you talk about in your book, if we hear, somebody, we connect with their voice, you get those feelings and sensations of and emotions that go with listening to that. So there certainly has to be more than just the straight neural connection from your ear to auditory center, that we
Yeah,
have to have all
what's
these
kind
branches.
of surprising is, uh, I mean, it's right in front of us, the fact that if you look at the ear has 3 times as many outer hair cells as inner hair cells. And the inner hair cells is primarily our ear to brain pathway. But the outer hair cells, the larger pathway, is the way in which the ear listens to the brain. And the ear will listen to the brain based on our life in sound, based on what we have learned. And so this efferent system, and the efferent system, which again is massive, and involves not just the traditional auditory structures, but in fact how we think and feel and move and integrate our other senses. This efferent system is the secret sauce. That is what uh, evolves and teaches us over the course of our lifetime. Um, it as we make different sound to meaning connections throughout our lives, it's through that efferent system. And I write about this at some length in the book, but I also, I hope your listeners, and you might put up a link to this, um, I put this concept into a very short piece. It's just 400 words. It's in the journal in hearing research. And I talk about the beams hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And what it is that B stands for brain, E stands for efferent. So, as we learn with experience, our brain to ear pathway uh, changes. And as we learn things really, really well, our afferent pathway, which is our ear to brain pathway, actually also changes. That becomes our new default system. I mean, you and I will respond to the sound of our name being called even when we're asleep, because that's the default pathway. We've had a lot of experience with that sound, particularly you and me with our names.
Mhm.
And so the whole circuitry is changing, the efferent system and then eventually the afferent system. And then that constitutes the M. So I have B, E, A. I have B, I have
Mhm.
brain. Efferent is E. A is afferent. M is memory.
Mhm.
MS, memory for sound. So that as we experience our many sound to meaning connections, we also create our memories, our auditory memories, which if you think about what is it that makes us individuals, it
Mhm.
is our memory, our particular memories that we
Mhm.
can walk into a place and again based on the experiences that we have had in our life,
Mhm.
um, our
So hearing
memory of
you,
sound is really tight.
yeah. So hearing you as my mind ticking over in terms of being a clinician and trying to assess can we assess this kind of efferent feedback system, because you're right, it obviously is the one that helps fine tune, and as a clinician wanting to help facilitate sort of improvement, obviously I want this system to be this feedback system to
Yeah,
be
yeah. So
efficient.
and again, I think another real motivating force in my own career and as it is in yours is to take what we know and to apply it, right? To
Mhm.
actually um, use it for good in education, in medicine, um, and um, so we have been measuring the brain's response to sound, which we call the frequency following response. The frequency
Mhm.
following response, or FFR, has been around for many decades, but we have capitalized on that technology and have refined it so that we can measure the brain's response to very complex sounds like speech and music. And what we have found is not only do individuals have their own way of um, registering, of hearing the world, but this is something that probably the strongest way it can be used clinically is as a subject as his own control.
Mhm.
So, say before um, a child on the autism spectrum undergoes some of your treatment, you have a baseline, and
Mhm.
then over time, you can see how the brain's response to sound has changed.
So am I right in thinking the otoacoustic emissions, that something that could be used just for a clinician to sort of see, is this if
Not
fair enough?
really.
Okay, I'm not on the
No,
right track. Okay.
it's not going to tell you. I mean,
Mhm.
yes, we know that crudely otoacoustic emissions are, somewhat different in a person who is a musician who has spent a lot of time making music. But you're not going to get the kind of granularity that
Mhm.
you get with the actual brain response from the frequency following response that, for example, a child on the autism spectrum, um, a child on the autism spectrum typically does not have difficulty understanding the words that are said. It is often the intention.
Mhm.
So, am I asking a question? Am I mad? Am I sad? Am I making a statement? How emphatic am I being? And so with the frequency following response, we can measure the brain's response to a change in pitch. So as if I'm asking a question, I'll say, what? If I'm making a statement, I'll say, what? And so pitch either goes up or down very, very simply. And most typically developing kids will, you can see that the frequency following response will follow that particular pitch change. And you can, you can predict what the child heard by looking at the brain's response. You can see, oh, look, I can see a sweep in frequency going up. And what we have discovered is that there are some kids on the autism spectrum who just fail to track these changes in pitch, which are so important for indicating what it is that that you mean. And it is also very much linked to prosody. I have a whole chapter in my book about rhythm and the rhythm of speech. Everyone is very familiar with the rhythm of music, but the rhythm of speech is tremendously important, and it's partly important in signaling intent. And so being able to measure the brain's response to these different ingredients in sound. And so if you think about sound, sound consists of many ingredients. And I think one of the reasons that sound is under-recognized is because it's invisible. And if you take any visual object like this book, you can see it has a color, a shape, a size, a texture. So these are all the ingredients. And sound has ingredients too. It has ingredients like pitch, timing, timbre, phase, harmonics, loudness, prosody. These are all different ingredients that are captured in a single sound wave. As I'm saying hello, all of that, you've got pitch, timing, timbre, harmonics, all of that is right there. And so in the brain's response to just something like hello, you can really get a sense of, well, where are the child's strengths? Where are the child's bottlenecks in terms of processing these different ingredients in sound? And this is something that then we can think about and also monitor with time and with therapy.
And the FFR response helps to detect for children who are having difficulties with prosody, with tracking prosody, of that inflection, that can help sort of monitor that as well.
Absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And it's it does require sophisticated technology, but it's not it's not really that difficult to obtain the data. You only need a couple of scalp electrodes and a couple of earbuds, and you kind of you press go, and the FFR will be generated in time, and have a look at how this particular child is responding to a sound that you care about.
So I know your lab's done quite a lot of obviously extensive different kinds of tools to help assess. A lot of it's like looking at the EEG of how we're processing sound in the brain. Did you ever look at middle ear muscles? Obviously Paul just looked a lot at the role of the middle ear muscles and stabilizing that ossicle chain and the tympanic membrane. Did you all ever look at that at all, or?
No, we haven't. And I think that I've become increasingly interested in the the reflex
Mhm.
pathway. I mean, again, we know that the reflex pathway is malleable, is something that can be changed.
Mhm.
But I don't know in particular kids. I think, for example, we've studied kids on the autism spectrum. We've studied kids who are dyslexic, have difficulty learning to read, which of course is based on often a difficulty hearing different sounds, different harmonics, different prosodic events,
Mhm.
different rhythms.
Mhm.
And so this is something that we are able um, to measure and to then apply with a clinical perspective. It gives the clinician that much more information about the child, the strengths, the bottlenecks, and also a very objective way of looking at change.
Mhm.
But it would be very fascinating, I think, if at the same time middle ear function was measured. And so you could see the extent to which, um, perhaps it's just a single ingredient in the frequency following response um, that is that tracks
Mhm.
with middle ear muscle activity. I I really don't know.
Yeah, I was just curious. I have a background I did my training in EEG biofeedback, so I certainly find um, that just another fascinating area and another gateway into look what's happening in the brain. And then obviously using biofeedback, we can use that first as a therapy approach as well. Um, since we're talking about rhythm, you have a great chapter in your book just really talking about rhythm. And actually, I remember I initially come across your work, Nina, years ago when I lived in Florida and had a pediatric practice. And one of the therapy tools that I used was the interactive metronome. And I think your lab had done some work on that, so, that temporal timing and language. But then I know there was a research that you did where I think it was with toddlers, and you were looking at if they could replicate a drum rhythm, and then you followed them later on. And what you all found is when they were young, if they could not imitate or replicate a rhythm, that these were the kiddos that had difficulty actually learning what language and reading. So I wonder if you could just, and I remember reading, I was like, oh my gosh, this would be a fantastic, just really easy identifier assessment tool for kids at risk.
Yes, yeah. Well, but we're not the first ones
Mm,
to discover that rhythm and the ability to, for example, in train to a beat,
mm,
is quite associated with reading ability and language ability. And we've seen this, um, but I think one of the things that we have learned is that rhythm, um, that there are many kinds of rhythm. And at first when I um, began doing research on rhythm at Brain Vaults, um, I thought, and we had many different rhythmic tasks. We had tasks where kids were following along with the beat. They had to reproduce a rhythm. They had to um, um, uh, be aware of whether uh, timing cues were happening. Um, and I thought that if a child was good at rhythm, that they'd be good across the board at all these different rhythm tasks. And we discovered is that in fact there are very different rhythm intelligences. And one of the reasons that I think music is such a powerful sonic uh, world for us is that just rhythmically, if you think of following a beat, you have the time signature. So, you might say shave and a haircut, 2 bits. And so, that you could just denote it as this, well, this is what the time signature is. Or you can look at the note values and again, note, am I saying shave and cut 2 bits, right? So the duration, I have these long notes, these short notes, and they are shown by the note values. So in music, inherently, both with the underlying rhythm and by the rhythms overlaid by the note values and the rests, the quiet, that's all part of rhythm skills, and you cannot predict how well a person will be good, how well a person will do on following a beat based on their ability to tap out a rhythm pattern, or vice versa. A child's ability to follow a rhythm pattern is not going to predict how he's going to be in terms of in training to a beat. So these are different skills, and one of the things that and they align with different underlying brain activity. You can imagine that following a pattern is slower because it has to evolve over time, right? Whereas the beat has to be very, very precise and it occurs at a precise moment in time, and so that is associated with the brain's response to sound that is very, very fast. And of course, there's overlap between these two domains, but interactive metronome spans both of these. And so the research that we've done, and you can find, I on our website under rhythm, we have a whole section on interactive metronome, because by now we've done 5 or 6 studies using interactive metronome. I was so skeptical when we first started this work, and someone twisted my arm, and then I again was surprised, which is one of the fun things about doing science. But also again, there is an article that I will you can link to. It's in the Hearing Journal, and it is about rhythmic medicine, and it is about our experience with interactive metronome. So I think we call it something like digital music, digital rhythmic medicine. Anyway, I'll send it to you.
Okay, good.
But what I did, or we did in that article, is kind of pull together what we learned from the many different studies that we did on interactive metronome, and try to provide a conceptual framework for that work. So maybe that will be of help to clinicians, and I think that again, it's something that can be followed over time, and I think it has a place at the therapeutic table.
So in your study, what did you actually, was it with the kids you had an issue with being on the beat, or the kids who had an issue replicating the rhythm were the ones that went on to have the language and reading difficulties? What tended to be? Or was it both?
Yeah, well, I mean, kids can have different patterns.
Yeah, you're right.
But the most obvious one was really just the ability to synchronize to a beat. And this also takes a while to develop. So we had a project, an NIH-funded project called Bio Beats and Bio Tots, where we started with 3-year-olds and followed them as they then learned to read for the next 5 years. And so the 3-year-olds, some of them were having a hard time synchronizing to the beat.
Mhm.
And but in time, they could learn developmentally to do this. But what was interesting is at the same time, we assessed their language skills,
Mhm.
and we were able to see that the kids with the better language skills also had the better rhythm skills.
Mhm.
And in measuring the FFR, we could
Mhm.
see that the brains of the kids who had the better rhythm skills and the better language skills, these were the kids whose response to sound was also following all of the rhythmic patterns in
Mhm.
the sound wave. So you
Mhm.
could see in their brain response that they were following these rhythmic contours.
So interesting. And then I know in your book also you talk about that, well, obviously rhythms in communication as well, in terms of the back and forth and the timing, and that's kind of like a rhythm as well. Um,
Yeah,
and
very much
rhythm.
so. I mean, again, if we think of sound as connecting us, it's this back and forth of being attuned to each other's rhythms, and it gets a little more complicated over Zoom, but generally we're pretty good at knowing when it's your turn to talk and when it's my turn to talk, and it's we get these rhythmic cues that um, that connect us and help us work in sync.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. I think you do some nice things in the beginning of your book of just really highlighting how important our sound world is and how we do take it for granted. And you do, I mean, I know I've done it myself, and I think you give the example of saying like, oh, if you ask somebody what sense would you prefer to lose, your vision or your hearing, and most people will say, well, I couldn't lose my vision, so I'd lose my hearing, but yet our hearing really is what really, really does sort of connect us and help keeps us safe. And so I'm hoping people get out of today that just how important our sound world, um, our sound world is. So I just wanted to move on to, because you've done some amazing research in some other clinical areas, and just sort of unpack that a little bit. But also highlighting that we talk about neuroplasticity in the brain, that you talk about that our auditory system is very plastic as well.
Yeah, it's both plastic and stable. You don't want to have a nervous system that changes every second. Um, that would be disorienting. So certain things, you learn the nervous system has both stability and the great ability to change based on the connections that are made. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that the connections made through sound, especially because our sonic world engages how we think and feel and move and coordinate our other senses. All of this is something that we learn.
Mm-hmm.
And we've learned, for example, that there are certain kinds of neural signatures associated, for example, with with playing a musical instrument. So by a musician, I really just mean anybody who regularly plays a musical instrument. And what we see is that especially the timing cues and the harmonic cues are enhanced in people who make music, and of course, voice counts. Um, and if you think the harmonic cues, the harmonics in sound are what um, help us distinguish a tuba and a flute playing the same note. That's the harmonics. But the harmonics also enable us to tell the difference between a D and a G. So what we learn through music is very, very relevant to language.
Mm-hmm.
We find that the bilingual signature really strengthens certain pitch cues, which help group us as auditory objects. So this is Nina talking. That's a waterfall over there. Um, and we find with kids on well, kids who have language disorders like reading disorders and developmental language delays, typically have trouble with timing and harmonics. The autism spectrum kids are distinct in their own way because they really do have this difficulty often with pitch changes, with these prosodic changes in pitch.
Mhm.
Um,
Often a lot
so
of
yeah,
the psychologists or people who work with individuals with trauma, a lot of them have difficulty or misreading cues in pitch or prosodic inflection, where often they sort of misinterpret a neutral tone as aggressive or defensive, or or misreading the emotional content in it, which I know often is what we see in autism as well. Um, so when you said in the book that our auditory sense is very plastic, to say that with therapy, and that we know that this sense of detecting, or more accurately detecting, the emotions in voice can change.
yeah, very much so. And I think there's often a misconception that it's too late to change, that as you're an adult or an older person. But I mean, the fact is, and we know this very well from research across species, is that the brain will continue to change until we die. So you have this inherent plasticity, which is why it is so important for. I mean, this is why we undertake therapies that we think can help change our brain for the good. It is also why, in the last chapter of my book, it's my call to action.
Mhm.
It's really important that we think about the choices that we make in our lives for um, the sounds around us,
Mhm.
and how much. Again, people don't realize what an impact, a negative impact, noise has. And I'm not talking about loud noise, but just moderate level noise has on, again, our cardiovascular health and our ability to think and our emotions. So these are choices we can make, and we can, choose to learn languages. We can choose to undertake certain therapies. We can choose to make music. We can choose to spend our time in ways that honor sound. And, um, I mean, just things like, um, making music with your family, or talking to your child instead of to your phone. These are so many daily decisions that we can make in our lives, that really revolve around sound, because sound is it's such a powerful force for health, which is also why, because making sense of sound is one of the hardest jobs that we ask our brain to do. If you get hit in the head, if you sustain a concussion, that will disrupt sound processing in the brain. And this is another area that we are studying, because at Northwestern University we have our Big Ten athletes, and we have an NIH grant that is enabling us to follow these athletes, all 500 of them, males and females, before and after their sports season. And if anyone sustains a concussion, we follow them very carefully.
Mhm.
And again, with concussion, if you go to a sports medicine conference, people are everybody is talking either about balance
Mhm.
or about vision.
Mhm.
And hearing is only recently
Mhm.
beginning to be a blip on the horizon. But in fact, again, with the frequency following response, you can really measure the brain's response to sound and see if it has been disrupted by a concussion. Again, it can be used as a metric for
So what do you
deciding.
typically see then post concussion in that?
Well, it depends on when the concussion was sustained. Are we looking immediately after concussion, or is this something over time? Because initially, and concussions are they're very hard to see, and they're very different one from the other, depending on where, how hard you got hit. I mean, so many different things. So some people who sustain a concussion have entirely normal frequency following responses. And there are others who, in fact, shortly after the concussion, the processing of almost every sound ingredient is disrupted. And over time, you can see different ingredients coming back online. And one of the ones that is the longest to come back is the fundamental frequency, which is a very important pitch cue. And there have been some athletes who, even after they've recovered, still have a diminished response to the fundamental frequency, which is a very important grouping cue. But it is our hope, if we can manage to scare up the resources to do this. I really do. There's very good reason to believe that rhythm therapies, the kinds like interactive metronome, may be quite helpful as a strategy, as one of the strategies to help an athlete recover from the concussion.
Interesting.
Most concussions just resolve on their own within a week or two, but then maybe 20% or so, I mean, a sizable number, can continue to have symptoms for quite prolonged period of time. And
actually, there's recurrent over time too, isn't it?
Yes, but one of the things that intrigues me about your work is that there are a number of athletes who have sustained a concussion even years ago, who still suffer from hyperacusis. And this is something that we really don't understand very well. And we don't understand very well how to treat it. I know you have your ways, which I think is so important, because hyperacusis is a big problem that is under-recognized and undertreated. But it's been rather fascinating as athletes have learned about our work. I get correspondence from, oceans of correspondence from people who say, ever since I sustained a concussion, I have had difficulty hearing a noise, and I'm very sensitive to sound, hypersensitive to sound. So that's another component here that I think is part of the picture.
Yes, yeah. Obviously, all very complex, and a lot of the hyperacusis within our sort of framework is looking from a polyvagal perspective, where you've got a heightened stress response, and so therefore, like a shift in those middle ear muscles, sort of kind of loosening their tension, so the ear opens up as a sort of evolutionary survival response to detect other possible threat-related sounds in the environment. But at the same time, sounds become, heightened. And then the ability to pull voice from background noise becomes impaired as well. So, that's very curious with concussions. I know I've attended some workshops on neurofeedback for people with concussions, and they've had some good results from doing neurofeedback. So on the other side with your athletes, you actually did some research to actually, if I have interpreted it correctly, to show that there's actually gains in our auditory processing from being involved in athletic endeavors.
Absolutely. So, my view is that every child should have a music education. Every child should be strong, physically strong and flexible. And athletics are hugely important. And I'm afraid, in our society, we so often just focus attention on the kids who make varsity, on the students who show extraordinary strengths in playing violin. But this is for everyone. This is for every person. And so because we are doing this large scale study and we are testing these elite athletes, they're just, wonderful and so fit, without sustaining a concussion. We were wondering, well, would being an athlete strengthen the sound mind? And so, we asked first, well, would some of these ingredients, pitch, timing, timbre, prosody, would some of these ingredients, the processing of them, would they be stronger? And we didn't see that there was a strength in any of the processing. But what we did discover is that the brain is always active and there's always electricity in the brain. And we discovered that the athletes have excessively, uncommonly quiet brains. And so as a consequence, their ability to make sense of sound, their ability to make sense of all kinds of environmental stimuli are better, because it's a simple signal to noise issue, where if the noise is very low, the signal pops out. And this is in contrast to what we see in kids who have suffered linguistic deprivation, kids who have grown up in poverty. These children have excessively noisy brains. And so, this is something that I think we can draw on and learn also, for example, the musician and the bilingual, they have a stronger sense of sound processing by enhancing the processing of certain sound ingredients. But the background noise is the same as in a typical person. The athlete is able to make better sense of sound in a different way, not by strengthening those particular ingredients, but by having a quieter background.
Interesting. So that makes me think of, is it, as a clinician, my framework, we're looking at that sensory input coming up into the brain, and is that coming in through our extremities crisp and clear? Because crisp, clear sensory information comes into the cortex for clearer processing. So does that help to decrease the noise somewhat, so we can detect that input clearer? That's interesting. And obviously, as an athlete, you've got crisp information coming from my motor, my balance, my tactile, my vision, my hearing, and it's 24/7 crisp. So therefore, interesting. Because we often, our approach often is a bottom-up approach of helping those other sort of sensory systems get processed more efficiently in the brain for better output. So to segue then to, since we're talking about noise, as we get older, that our auditory system becomes more compromised, and also we get more noise in the brain. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about what actually happens with our auditory, and then obviously I'm sure going to lead to, well, what can we do as we get older to keep our sound mind, our ear and sound mind, as optimal as can be. And I know you're going to say music is one, which is
Honestly, one of what characterizes research on aging is the tremendous variability. Like if you look developmentally, there is less variability than you see on the older age of the spectrum, because we've had so many years to develop into who we are. And so our certainly our life and sound and all of our experience make some people and some brains very sound and some not so sound. For example, we do in a population can see more background noise in general with aging, but that's not the case with everybody at all. And if we have done a lot of work with people who regularly make music and aging, and we see that their response to sound is as good as anybody's response to sound at any stage of life. So there are clearly things that can be done, and therapeutic approaches. We've looked at various brain fitness programs, especially the ones that were designed by Mike Merzenich, Posit Science, and they were designed particularly with sound in mind.
I have his Brain HQ.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a
So
great program.
this is one, I think one of his earlier programs that were very, very, very associated with, they were based on sound. I don't know how the more recent ones are, but we did studies on older adults just to see if we measured hearing and noise, we measured memory, we measured the brain's response to sound, and the people who went through this training program for 8 weeks, we found that their memory got better, the timing in their brain got faster, so this is something that we saw over time, and we didn't see it in the controls who spent the same amount of time watching educational videos and answering questions about those videos. So clearly there are things that we can do, which comes back to the choices we make. How do we spend our time? And the hearing loss is a problem, but it's not as huge a problem. I mean, we hear with our brain, and we know that from, cochlear implants. You can bypass the whole ear, and you can affect hearing. A person can make sense of sound. So we hear with our brain. Think of Beethoven. That said, so like we've looked at people with mild and moderate presbycusis, age-related hearing loss, and found that what was actually the most important in terms of their brain responses to sound, in terms of how good they were at hearing a noise and their auditory memory, was what they had done in their lives. So people who did make music and were spoke multiple languages and were socially engaged, and physically fit. I mean, all of these are important factors, and there is only the factor. The factor of the actual audiogram is smaller than what you might expect. That said, if we start losing our hearing, we should make sure to get a hearing aid to amplify what we hear, So that because the hearing brain is vast and it engages how we think and feel and move and interact with the world and our other senses, if you are not hearing well, it will affect your ability to think and to remember.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot of the fear and scare of Alzheimer's, which is certainly very real and very true, but I think to some extent, um, people are very freaked out when they start, not remembering as well or feeling like they're thinking as clearly. But a lot of it, in many cases, can come just from not hearing as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing, because the brain is plastic, I really would encourage anyone who gets a hearing aid to stay with it, because the brain, we're lucky that we have a brain that doesn't change on a dime. It
Mm-hmm.
will change over time depending on what we do, but we need to retrain
Mm-hmm.
the brain
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to pay attention to sound in a slightly different way. And
Mm-hmm.
it's something that it takes time to change the brain.
Because in you speak in your book that there's a higher incidence of dementia with hearing loss.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
and that's the work that Bialystock has done, and yeah, and others. I mean, it really has been,
Mm-hmm.
um, the link between how we think,
Mm-hmm.
and we actually found, um, um, even in people who get a hearing aid, they often report being able to think better,
Mm-hmm.
because the system, as we started out, um, saying this is a holistic system. It's
Mm-hmm.
so interrelated
Mm-hmm.
to our biology,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah.
Mm-hmm. I remember Dr. Minson, who was part of the integrated listening systems, talks about, sound as a nutrient for the brain, that it really does sort of, when you think about it, when all those little hair cells get stimulated, it brings electrical activity to the brain. And we know when you listen to violins that you feel energized and uplifted, and it is very sort of, yeah, good for our brains. Unfortunately, all that I have learned, I did not grow up learning a musical instrument, so that's not one of the strategies that I certainly could pick it up now. So for people listening, what would be your advice for them to help keep their like a sound mind healthy?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, be aware of sound,
Mm-hmm.
recognize sound. You know, do see if you do have a hearing loss, if that is something that um, can be helped. But I think much more important, it's a lifestyle issue of, um, choosing how we spend our time. And one of the wonderful things about, say, playing a musical instrument or learning another language, you don't have to be good to
Mm-hmm.
get a lot of the benefits. For many, learning, just sitting down at the piano or at some instrument for 5 or 10 minutes a day, it's a form of meditation. It's a form of engaging in flow. It's a way of, again, because with, music, to me, is, as a biologist who has studied learning through sound, and sound, our hearing brain engaging our cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward systems. Well, music is kind of the jackpot. So, I really encourage people, and even encourage, encourage parents of children. I think one of the best things that one can do is to play, to make music, to engage um, in important sonic experiences like conversation. So to really, and to think about what gets in the way of a good conversation. Maybe we need to have a heating system that's quieter. Noise, we live in a very noisy world, and we don't realize it's just things. I mean, we don't even realize that we are aware of the noise until it goes away. We often we have the experience
Yes.
of the air conditioning turning off, or the truck outside that it was idling, and it kills they kill the ignition, and suddenly, you didn't even realize that the noise was there. But when it goes off, you you take a breath. And so, I think we live in a constant state of alarm because of our noisy world. But it does get in the way of our communications with sound. So, I think being really aware of what can we do, and also not to distract ourselves. We get beeped. Our dryer tells us when it's done. Car fobs have to beep unless you turn it off. But does my neighbor have to hear every time I come home or
Right.
leave?
Yes.
There's so many things that we can choose not to break our focus, not to disorder our mind, so that we can keep it sound. And I think that we really do have a choice in many things like that. I think we, as a species, we are forgetting how to listen, because if there's so much racket going on, you won't hear the nuances of, the sounds that are around us. And so that really is, I think, a wonderful way of honoring sound in our lives, and strengthening the sound mind.
And you're right, is that it's a cumulative effect of all that environmental noise, the industrial world, or modern world sort of noise that we all sort of take for granted. But our nervous system, or our underlying autonomic nervous system, is always, as you say, on guard and aware of it. And when it does stop, it is like that, oh my gosh, that effect. But that's going to impact your wellness over time, your immune system, your cardiovascular system, as you mentioned, and your state of mind, and how you regulate your mood and behavior. So I know in your book you give some other strategies about, even wearing earplugs or noise cancellation headphones, and you sort of go into a few more sort of details about those other strategies to help with sort of managing that other noise, to decrease that load on your body.
I think I am personally not a fan of noise canceling headphones, because they actually produce noise to cancel the noise. And so, sound is pressure. That's why we measure it in sound pressure level. And so you're creating additional pressure, and often the cancellation is not perfect. So you have many people experience fatigue after using noise canceling headphones for a while. There are many things we don't know about them, but it's my scientific gut feeling, at least for myself, that I would rather use a passive ear mold, or I actually like to use the wax ear protection, because it molds to my twisty turny ear canals.
So what would be your suggestion for people who travel a lot on airplanes, the noise cancelling or the actual like earplugs?
Well, so earplugs, if you're not listening to something, like
Mm-hmm.
just passive earplugs. And if you are listening to something, I have gotten um, um, my if I want to be listening to an audiobook or to some music, I have a driver, so it's going to be delivering sound.
Mm-hmm.
That is, it can either be a cord or Bluetooth, but I have it is actually inside an ear mold.
Mm-hmm.
So I have an ear mold that is shaped to my ear. So
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, it is blocking the noise of the engines
Mm-hmm.
while it is delivering really nice sound
Mm-hmm.
from the audiobook or the music that I'm listening to. I
Mm.
use these also when I play drums. You can see drums back
Yeah,
there.
so I noticed your drums in
Um,
the background.
so we these um, these insert um, uh, phones and earplugs serve as earplugs because it attenuates the sound that I'm making, while at the same time, if I'm playing together with my favorite band, I can hear that very, very clearly.
Mm-hmm.
So there are various things that we can do, and I
Mm-hmm.
also want to mention something about aging. Um, the If you go to a conference on aging, everything that you can measure gets worse in
Mm-hmm.
terms of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I know as I'm getting older, I used to be able to unlock my back door holding a baby, not waking up the baby, and a bag of groceries very quickly. Now, even with my hands empty, I gotta find the right key and then get it in the lock, and things are slower. But there is so much that our culture and also we lose track of biologically is the things we can't measure, like wisdom. And there's a reason that in certain cultures, older people really are honored because of I mean, just think of how much more you know now than you did decades ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we are sometimes um, and I think that this kind of goes along with with a holistic perspective. We're just focused on what you can measure
Mm-hmm.
and not on the things. I mean, it's very, very difficult to measure wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
and yet it exists.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
so I think it's important in this age of measurement
Mm-hmm.
that I mean I love measurement. It's really important. It's the basis for so much of what I do.
Right.
But we cannot lose track of what are all the things that we're not measuring.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And and I think that you um, I think that you have some sense of that in the clinical
Yeah.
practice that you do.
100%, because I know so much things you can't measure where you see over time, particularly for a child with autism, for instance, where, we'll look at, well, do they have eye contact? But I don't want a child just staring at me. I want a child who has a sense of presence, a sense of awareness of me, and an interest to engage with me as another human being. So how do you measure that? You can't. But it's all those subtleties which really are the foundations that make us human, that makes us, I know they're the beginnings of we're going to get change here. We're going to get momentum. And that when I see those things beginning, though, you can't measure those. No, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, emotional intent. Well, Nina, we've gone way over time with what I thought. You've been so lovely with your time and sharing your knowledge. And I know there's other things I'd love to ask you that are in your book, but people just need to read your book. And I know you talk a lot about just the impact of sound in nature, and there's some amazing little tidbits of knowledge in there, so people need to read the book. But I think for our clinical world listening to this, as well as we have just listeners of people who are trying to find wellness and health in their life, whether it's physical wellness from immune issues, from chronic fatigue, or wellness for mental health. I think our interaction with sound is another big piece of the puzzle in that journey of being a better clinician, but also helping people, optimize their health. So please check out Nina's lab, Brain Vaults, as well as read her book of Sound Mind. You'll get a lot out of it. And I will put links in the podcast to those additional resources that Nina spoke about, as well as a book. And again, Nina, thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you, and have a lovely afternoon, rest of your afternoon. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much. And I really love your very thoughtful questions and your thoughtful correspondence leading up to the interview. So thank you.
I hope everyone enjoyed this session just as much as I did speaking with Nina. We did not touch on all the topics discussed in her book, so I encourage you to read of Sound Mind. I just want to add a few more points that I took from reading Nina's book. Firstly, I wish to emphasize the importance of expanding our knowledge to be more aware of the impact of sound on our neuroceptive system, and as a consequence, our ability to maintain optimal homeostasis for mental and physiological well-being. Dr. Kraus quotes Helen Keller: "Blindness disconnects us from things. Deafness disconnects us from people." As polyvagal informed individuals or therapists, we certainly understand the importance of being able to connect. How we process sound, voices, greatly impacts this. Nina's work has expanded our knowledge of the importance of the more complex neural feedback system from the brain to the ear to fine-tune our listening and create the connection of meaning in sound. Her lab has developed key measures of understanding auditory processing in the brain. Interestingly, significant processing occurs in the midbrain, where we know there are connections to the amygdala and motor centers, which are wired to speedily process sound for safety or defense. Cross also speaks about whole brain processing of sound, with significant crosstalk with other senses. She says that making sense of sound is profoundly governed by how we feel, think, see, and move, and conversely influences how we feel, think, see, and move, and that the sounds of our lives shape our brain. Sound is an invisible ally or enemy of brain health. I'll include the links to Nina's lab, Brain Vaults, as well as links to the 2 articles Nina spoke about during our discussion. These will be linked in the show notes. My next guest is Dr. Ariel Schwartz, who teaches about polyvagal theory and yoga. Take care until next time. All the best, Joanne. If you'd like to learn more about the Safe and Sound Protocol in Australia and New Zealand, please contact Integrated Listening Australia. The website is integratedlistening.com.au, and for the rest of the world, please contact Unite Integrated Listening at integratedlistening.com.